So this week, the title of my message is different. It's different. It's a saying that you might have heard, but I believe it's going to help somebody this week. It'll all make sense. But the title of my message this week is, Let's Get This Bread. How many of you guys have heard that before? Show of hands. Let's get this bread. Maybe you're playing Fortnite and you're trying to get a win, or Warzone. You shout out in the lobby, let's get this bread. That's what I do. I know I do. Maybe you have a job, and before you're motivated, to motivate yourself, you tell yourself, all right, I'm about to get this bread. Let's get this bread. Whatever way you use it, you've probably heard it before. Let's get this bread. So I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell them, let's get this bread. Yell it at them. Let's get this bread. There we go. So I have a question for you. What's the first restaurant that you think of when you think about bread? Just yell it out. Outback. Some people said Panera, Olive Garden, Tender Greens, Olive Garden, I think. McDonald's. Okay. I don't know what kind of bread you get at McDonald's. So we all have a restaurant in mind, right, when we think about bread. Mine in particular is Panera. I have a horrible, nightmarish story about Panera. When I was the tender age of 18, I went out to Panera Bread with a friend. I had never been there before, but they were telling me all about this amazing macaroni that you just have to get, and they were telling me about this amazing sandwich that you just have to try, and I was like, okay, sure, whatever. Let's go to Panera Bread. Fine, I'll go. So I went, and I got the amazing sandwich that I had to try, and I got the amazing macaroni that I couldn't live without. And the first bite of my sandwich literally drew blood. I bit down on this hard piece of bread, and my gums started bleeding. That is my idea when I think of Panera Bread. When I think of bread, I think of Panera, and I think of my teeth and gums bleeding. So you get that mental image tonight. So when you go to bed, you think of yourself eating Panera and your teeth bleeding. So yeah, there's that. That's what I think of when I think of Panera Bread. I'll never go there again. So I haven't been back. So I'm just not a fan. But I'm not just talking about bread for no reason, okay? I'm not just up here talking about bread because it's fun and I like bread. I'm talking about bread because our passage actually has to do with bread today. The passage in the Bible that we're going to read is out of Matthew 16, verses 5 through 12. And this will all make sense in a second, I promise you. So it says this. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Uh-oh. Disciples are like Tyrone out here forgetting my table. Anyway, be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets full you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So what in the world is going on here, right? Why is Jesus and the disciples, why are they talking about bread? This doesn't make any sense. At least that's what I thought when I first read it. I'm like, why are they talking about bread? Why is bread the hot topic today? And then Jesus kind of expounds, but just for some context, for some background on what's going on, Jesus and the disciples had just got done having a heated discussion with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. So they were like all hot and bothered and sweaty. They had just got done with this conversation. Well, if you're anything like me, you ask, well, who in the world are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And why is Jesus mad at them? Why? I don't understand why they would be so upset or why they would be so frustrated. Well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they are really well known for being super hypocritical and know-it-alls. Does anybody know a know-it-all here? Yeah, okay, we got some. You probably are picturing that person in your mind right now. This person is such a know-it-all. Well, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were like that person, but times like 5,642. Like way worse than the person that you're thinking of. Because the Pharisees and the Sadducees thought that they knew everything about religion. They thought that they knew the perfect ways to do it, and they thought that they were almost above religion. They just knew so much. And they were religious, some of them were religious officials, so people looked to them and paid attention to them and wanted to hear what they had to say because these guys studied the word so much. That's kind of some background on who the Pharisees and the Sadducees were. So where we pick up in this story is the disciples in Jesus' awkward boat ride to the next place that they're going. How many of you guys have ever been in like an awkward car ride when like a big argument or some sort of conversation happened and it's just mad quiet? Nobody's saying anything. You don't even want to text on your phone because the keys are loud or your screen might be loud. Like it's just awkward. You don't want to move. It's so awkward. And that's kind of like what's going on in this boat ride. Now, picture this. Imagine this with me, okay? Everybody close your eyes and imagine this scene. You are on a boat with the disciples, right? And you're rocking. You can feel the waves. You can feel a little bit of motion. Some of you probably getting seasick right now, right? You can hear the breeze and the boat smash up against, or the water smash up against the boat. Like, it's very peaceful. It's very calming, right? And then all of a sudden, Jesus says, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Now, you can open your eyes. Now, I don't know about you, but if the only thing that has been said for like 2 hours is be on your guard about the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I would look at Jesus like, man, what are you talking about? What is going on in your mind? What are you talking about? I don't understand. Where did you even get that from? Why are you talking about bread? I'm so confused. Now, or maybe you're like me, actually. The first thing I would ask is like, Jesus, what is yeast? I don't know. Maybe everybody here, they're master bakers and they know everything about everything, but I am not. I would have been like, Jesus, I see you're bothered right there, but what is yeast? Now, yeast is something that bakers typically use and they use it in their dough to help bread rise or whatever they're baking. It helps it rise. And I learned this. This is really cool. The longer it takes for the yeast to rise or the dough to rise, the more flavorful the bread is, the more flavorful the dough is. So if the yeast is in there doing its job and it's doing a good job and it's taking its time, the bread is going to taste better. That's what the role of yeast is. It helps dough rise. So I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. All right. So Jesus is over here talking about dough. Okay, interesting. All right, Jesus. Where are you going with this, right? What are you really talking about? Now, I can imagine that the disciples are like mad confused. Now, they had an understanding of what yeast was, unlike us. Like they had a good idea of what yeast was. They weren't worried about that, but they were still confused by the fact that Jesus just randomly said this. Like, where did this come from? I still have no clue like what you're trying to get at. Now, in this context, in this story, the yeast that Jesus is talking about is not actual like bread yeast. He's not talking about that. The yeast in this story, the yeast in this context is actually truth. He's talking about truth. Here's my absolute favorite part about this whole story. They thought that Jesus was upset with them for forgetting bread on their trip. Now, a little bit more context. This is something that the disciples would have done like all the time. On every single trip that they ever would go on, they would bring bread. They would never forget it. Like they would bring bread. That was just like when you leave the door, like you got your cell phone, you got your book bag, like you got your homework in there. Like those are things that you just don't forget, right? You bring those. You got your car keys if you drive. Those are the things that you bring. So the disciples forgetting bread would have been like they left their homework at home, or they left their keys at home, and now they can't get in the house, or they left their phone, now their mom can't text them, and they can't tell their mom where they're at. So you can see how the disciples would have been like, oh, shoot, we forgot the bread. That's not good. We probably should have remembered the bread. And here's the funny part, too. Like, Jesus is totally being Jedi Jesus. Like, he is like reading their thoughts. It's so funny. He is reading their thoughts, and they're like whispering to each other very, very quietly, like looking at each other like, how did you forget the bread? And Jesus is like, I'm not talking about bread. Like just Jedi Ninja Jesus. It's so funny. But then he goes on to say this in verse 11. How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread? Now, if I was on this boat, I'd be about ready to jump out. I'm just confused. I'm lost. I don't know what we're talking. Wait a minute. Yeast, Jesus, yeast is in bread. We're not talking about bread, but we are talking about bread. What is going on, Jesus? What do you mean you're not talking about bread? I don't understand. Jesus wasn't concerned about food. He was concerned about their faith. Jesus wasn't concerned about what they were consuming that day. He wasn't worried about whether or not they had eaten. He wasn't worried about what their favorite type of bread is and whether or not they brought it on the trip and whether or not they were going to eat it. Jesus was concerned about their faith. You see, the bread that he was actually referring to was not the physical loaf of bread that we're used to. The bread that he was referring to was actually representing their faith. That's what bread actually was in this story. That's what he was referencing. He was referencing their faith. And he was upset, not about the fact that they forgot about it, that they forgot about the bread. He was upset that he couldn't believe that the disciples, after spending all of this time, after knowing him for so long, could think that Jesus was even remotely talking about bread. That Jesus didn't speak in parables, that they didn't know him well enough to know that, of course, Jesus wouldn't be referring to actual bread. It'd be like, if you knew me well enough, what color do you think I'm going to wear tomorrow? You guys know me really well. Give yourself a round of applause. That was the great. I always wear black, somebody said out there, right? Every single day, you can count on it that I'm probably going to wear something black. And in the same manner, Jesus was like, how can you not know what I'm talking about? How can you spend all this time with me and know me, but still not know? That's what he was frustrated about. He was concerned that they could spend so much time with him and they still have no idea who he is. Think about this for a second. This is the same Jesus that fed multitudes twice. This is the same Jesus that took like a total of, 12 pieces of bread and fed a total of 9,000 people. That is the Jesus that they're talking to. Now, riddle me this. Do you think that Jesus is concerned with whether or not they have bread? Because this is the guy who could make something out of nothing. This is the guy who could do all things. This is the guy who nothing was impossible for. This is the guy who had done miracle after miracle after miracle after miracle, yet still, for some reason, the disciples still didn't believe. Still, for some reason, their faith wasn't all the way there. Still, for some reason, they didn't believe. You see, the real issue with the Pharisees and the Sadducees is that they were teaching people their version of what was true. They were teaching people their version of truth. It was a truth that sounds kind of good. It was a truth that's easy to hear. It was a truth that made sense. That's the kind of truth that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were teaching, but it wasn't true. And that's why Jesus was so angry. That's why Jesus was arguing with these guys. That's why Jesus was so upset. Because their version of truth was not true. So remember, if yeast is supposed to represent truth, and bread is supposed to represent our faith in this story, what Jesus is actually saying here is you can't raise your faith on any old truth. You can't raise your faith on any old truth. What you use to build your faith, what you use to raise your faith, truly does matter. This is why we can't listen to everything we hear or that we watch. This is why we are told to guard our hearts in Proverbs 4:23. This is why Jesus was telling them to watch out for those wicked people and their teaching. This is why we must get to know Jesus for ourselves. This is why. Because if you don't have your own faith, you will borrow someone else's. If you don't have your own faith, then you will borrow someone else's. It could be mine. It could be a parent's. It could be a friend's. It could be a relative's. It could be a teacher's. It could be anyone else's faith but yours. But if you are not careful and have your own faith, your own belief in Jesus Christ, then you will borrow someone else's ideas of who Jesus Christ is. And if they're anything like the Pharisees, it's not true. It is not who Jesus is. It is not what Jesus has come to do. It will actually have nothing to do with the character and the nature and who Jesus is. You see, our goal as Christians, as young Christians, is to know Jesus so well, is to spend so much time with Jesus, to understand Jesus so well that we know his heartbeat. Just like how you guys know me well enough to know what color I'm going to wear tomorrow, that's how well we need to know Jesus. That is where our heart should be when it comes to understanding and knowing who Jesus is. That we have spent so much time and that we have understood him and that we are trying so much to get an idea of how we're supposed to live in the world as Christ followers. That is the goal. Let me be honest with you. Let me be real. Let me be transparent. Let me be vulnerable. I don't want to borrow anybody's faith. Nobody's. Especially not in the world that we live in today. I don't want to borrow anybody's ideas, anybody's concept, anybody's truth. Because if it is not from the Word of God, I don't want to hear it. If it does not come from a place of love, a place of justice, a place of truth, all of the characteristics of our God in heaven, it doesn't belong to me. I want to ask you this question. Why do you think that there is so much violence and vulgar language and awful shows and horrible music everywhere? Why do you think that the world can be such a depressing place sometimes? Why do you think sometimes, if I'm being honest, it can be hard to want to live? Why do you think that? Well, here's your scary truth. The world wants nothing to do with our faith. The world doesn't want God. They don't want anything to do with God. The world is a selfish place that wants everything to do with themselves. So if you're taking ideals, if you're taking stuff from the world and trying to make it fit in your life, and you're shaping your life around what the world has to say about things, I promise you, you won't feel the hope. You won't feel the love. You won't feel the joy. You won't feel those things of Jesus, because the world's ideas are not of Jesus. Our world is godless. Here's our role as Christians: to bring God. That is my responsibility. That is your responsibility. You guys get an opportunity every single week to reach people like you in school, whether virtual or in person. You get an opportunity every single week to bring God to your school. And listen, I don't care what Christian school you go to. I don't care what private school you go to. I don't care what public school you go to. Your responsibility as Christ followers is to bring God to your school, to bring God to your extracurriculars, to bring God to your teams, to bring God to that Xbox party or that PS4 chat, to bring God to TikTok, to bring God to Snapchat. That is your responsibility as students, not just any students, as state line students. That is your responsibility. That is my responsibility too. But I can't do what you do. I can't be who you are, because God has made you unique. He's made me unique. So my challenge for each and every one of you this week is to get to know Jesus a little bit better. Is to find some time in your week this week to get to know Jesus a little bit better. To personalize the story of Jesus, to ask yourself, who is Jesus to me? Why does Jesus matter to me? Why do I love Jesus? Why should I love people? Ask yourself those questions, because the Bible says that the world will know that we are Christians by our love. Not by how much Bible knowledge we can spit at people, not by how many verses that we can memorize. They'll know us by how much we love. So ask yourself this week, how much do I love? Do I love a lot? Do I love a little bit? Am I hard to love? I am. I'm really hard to love. I'm a terrible person sometimes, if I'm being honest with you. These are questions that we have to ask ourselves. If the world wants nothing to do with our faith, if they want nothing to do with our God, if they're not just going to accept God like how we have, then we have to bring him. Every day. We don't get a day off. We have to do that every single day. I remember when I was an athlete, I'd get home from cross country and I'd be so excited to be done. I'd be like, oh man, I can take a shower, I can relax, I can do my homework, I can hang out and play video games. I am done. But our responsibility is, as Christ followers, to love on people, to share the gospel to this godless world that we live in. We can't take that off. We can never stop that. We can never be finished. We have to keep pressing. We have to keep going. We have to keep grinding. We have to keep getting this bread. We have to understand who Jesus is. Because the goal is to share. Is to share the bread. The goal is to get people so curious about Jesus that they want to understand who Jesus is, that they want to taste and see themselves that the Lord is good. That's the goal. And in order to be able to do that, you got to know it. You got to understand. You've got to love Jesus. So I don't know if you're posting or if you're on Instagram. If you are, please follow our Instagram account because we post a ton of stuff. It's super fun to be on that account. I love seeing what pops up every week because I post it sometimes. Chelsea does too. But I posted something the other day that was like just super simple steps on how to get the most out of youth group. And one of them is that you have to be here. If you're wondering like how do I grow my faith? How do I become a better Christ follower? How do I learn a little bit more? What do I do? How do I do that? You've got to be here. You've got to be here as much as you can because I promise you that no one else can save you but Jesus Christ. And if you don't know Jesus for yourself, I don't know what to tell you. And in that same vein, no, we cannot save our friends. Only Christ Jesus can save our friends. And that is why I push you guys every single week to invite your friends. That is why. Because I so desperately want every single student in Rockford to know who Jesus is. So desperately. Every single student to know, or at least get an opportunity to hear about the bread that we get every single week. Sound good? Yeah? Thumbs up? Sweet. All right, cool. Let's pray.